In 1945, nobody announced that Germany would become two countries. The Allies announced an occupation. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Its government had collapsed. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union divided the defeated country into 4 zones, while Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was divided among the same 4 powers. At Potsdam, the Allies even agreed that Germany should be treated as a single economic unit during the occupation. On paper, there was still one Germany. 4 years later, there were 2 German states facing each other across the opening front line of the Cold War. So what happened between those 2 maps? The obvious explanation is that the Allies planned East Germany and West Germany from the beginning. They did not. The occupation zones were administrative zones, not new countries. The 4 powers still spoke about Germany as a whole. They shared several basic goals: destroy German militarism, dismantle Nazi institutions, prosecute major war criminals, prevent another war, and rebuild political life under Allied control. But beneath that agreement was a question they could not answer together: what kind of Germany should eventually return? And more importantly, how strong should that Germany be? For the Soviet Union, this was not an abstract question. German armies had invaded Soviet territory twice within a generation, and the second invasion had devastated enormous areas of the country. Moscow wanted security, reparations, and a post-war Germany that could never again become the base for an attack from the West. France also feared the return of German power. The United States and Britain shared the fear of renewed aggression, but another concern was growing: if Germany remained economically shattered, the recovery of Western Europe might fail with it. German coal, steel, railways, factories, and markets had been deeply connected to the rest of Europe. That contradiction turned the occupation system into a trap. Germany was supposed to function as one economic unit, but each power controlled a separate zone and pursued different priorities inside it. A 4-power Allied Control Council was meant to coordinate policy. In theory, that preserved one Germany. In practice, major decisions required cooperation among governments whose trust was collapsing. Reparations became one of the earliest disputes. The Soviet Union removed industrial equipment from its zone as compensation for wartime destruction. The Western powers also dismantled German industrial assets, but American and British officials increasingly worried that excessive removals would leave Germany permanently dependent on outside support. Politics began moving in different directions as well. In the Soviet zone, the Communist Party and Social Democratic Party were merged in 1946 into the Socialist Unity Party, the SED, under strong Soviet pressure. Other parties continued to exist, but the political system increasingly favored the SED. In the Western zones, political parties also returned, but the occupation authorities allowed a more competitive parliamentary structure to develop. Nothing on the border yet said East Germany, or West Germany. But the institutions on either side were already beginning to answer the same post-war questions differently. Then Britain ran into a problem it could not ignore: money. Maintaining its occupation zone was expensive, and the British economy itself had been weakened by the war. The United States and Britain responded by combining their zones economically. On January 1, 1947, Bizonia came into operation. It did not create West Germany. France still administered its own zone, and the 4 powers still formally claimed responsibility for Germany as a whole. But Bizonia changed the logic of occupation. The Western powers were no longer waiting for a 4-power solution before building common institutions. To Washington and London, this was a practical response to paralysis. To Moscow, it looked increasingly like the construction of a separate Western Germany. That difference in interpretation became one of the engines of division. Every step one side described as defensive could be read by the other as preparation for a rival state. The 4 powers still tried to negotiate. Foreign ministers met in Moscow in 1947 and again in London later that year. They argued over reparations, economic unity, political organization, and the future of Germany. They failed to reach a comprehensive settlement. By 1948, waiting had become a policy of its own, and the Western powers were losing patience with it. The Marshall Plan made the problem sharper. Western European recovery now depended on trade, production, currency stability, and coordinated reconstruction. American policymakers increasingly concluded that the western zones of Germany could not remain economically isolated from that recovery. Moscow saw the same development and reached the opposite conclusion. A revived Western German economy tied to an American-backed European system could eventually become a strategic threat. Germany was no longer simply a defeated country under occupation. It was becoming a test of which post-war system would dominate Europe. In February 1948, the United States, Britain, and France opened talks in London with Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These six-power talks were a turning point because the question was no longer only how to administer occupation zones. The participants discussed how the Western zones could be integrated into Western European recovery and how a federal governmental structure could be created there. Western governments still left open the possibility of a later four-power settlement. But from Moscow's perspective, that reassurance was becoming difficult to accept. A common economy, a constitutional framework, and integration with Western Europe looked increasingly like the foundations of a Western German state. Then the machinery of four-power government broke down in public. On March 20, 1948, Soviet Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky walked out of the Allied Control Council after denouncing the Western talks in London. The institution created to govern Germany jointly never recovered as an effective four-power government. This did not create two Germanys overnight. But it removed the main mechanism that was supposed to keep the occupation zones moving together. The next major dispute would make the separation visible to ordinary Germans in something they used every day: money. By 1948, the old Reichsmark was failing as a practical currency. Shortages, rationing, price controls, barter, and black markets distorted daily economic life. The Western powers decided that recovery required currency reform. In June 1948, they introduced the Deutsche Mark in their zones. Soviet authorities introduced a separate currency in the East. A line that had once divided military administrations now also divided monetary systems. That mattered because a functioning currency was not just about buying bread or paying wages. It defined where taxes were collected, where prices worked, where investment could occur, and which economic system a region belonged to. Berlin turned that disagreement into a crisis. The western sectors of the city were controlled by the United States, Britain, and France, but they were surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. When Western currency reform reached the western sectors of Berlin, the argument over Germany became an argument over whether the Western powers could maintain an economic and political presence inside the Soviet zone. On June 24, the Soviet Union blocked the major road, rail, and canal routes linking the western zones to West Berlin. The Western powers refused to abandon the city. Instead, they began supplying it by air. The Berlin blockade deserves its own story, because the scale of the airlift would become one of the defining episodes of the early Cold War. But for Germany's political future, the meaning was already clear. The four powers were no longer acting like partners temporarily administering one defeated country. They were defending rival systems. And while aircraft were beginning to fly into Berlin, another process was moving forward in the West, one that would make a separate state possible. In July 1948, the Western military governors gave the leaders of the Western German states a framework for creating a new political order. Here the story takes an important turn, because German politicians were not simply waiting to be told what country they would receive. Many of them feared that creating a Western state would make Germany's division permanent. They did not want to appear to abandon Germans in the Soviet zone, and they resisted language suggesting that the Western zones alone represented a complete German nation. The compromise was deliberate. The new document would not be called a permanent constitution. It would be called the Basic Law. The distinction was political as well as legal. The Western German state was being designed to function, but it was also being presented as provisional, a structure that would remain open to eventual German unity. A parliamentary council met in Bonn to draft it. Its members were working with the memory of two failures behind them: the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the destruction of constitutional government under the Nazis. That experience shaped the system they created. Power would be divided between the federal government and the Länder. Government would depend on parliamentary support. Fundamental rights would receive strong protection. The federal president would be far weaker than the presidency had been under Weimar. And even then, the new Western state would not possess unrestricted sovereignty. The Western Allies retained important powers over security, foreign affairs, disarmament, Berlin, and Germany as a whole. West Germany was being created, but it was still being created inside an occupation. On May 8, 1949, 4 years after the end of the war in Europe, the Parliamentary Council adopted the Basic Law. It was promulgated on May 23. Elections followed in August. The first Bundestag convened in September, and Konrad Adenauer became the first federal chancellor. The Federal Republic of Germany now had functioning national institutions in the Western zones. But its leaders continued to treat German division as provisional. The new state did not present itself as the final answer to the German question. The Soviet zone had been developing its own state structures at the same time. The SED dominated political life, while the German People's Congress movement and the German People's Council developed institutions claiming an all-German political role. Once the Federal Republic was established, the Eastern process accelerated. On October 7, 1949, the German Democratic Republic was proclaimed in the Soviet occupation zone. East Germany now had a constitution, government institutions, political parties, and representative bodies, but effective political power increasingly centered on the SED within the Soviet-backed system. Now the transformation was complete enough to see on a map. In 1945, there had been one defeated Germany divided into occupation zones. By the autumn of 1949, there were 2 German states. Yet this was not a normal international border. Allied occupation rights remained. Berlin remained divided. West Berlin was linked politically to the West but was not simply an ordinary part of the Federal Republic. And both German states claimed, in different ways, that the German question remained unresolved. This is the point where the simplest version of the story breaks down. It is easy to say, the Allies divided Germany after World War II. That is true only in the first step. The Allies divided Germany into occupation zones. Those zones became states later. Reparations pulled economic policy apart. The SED transformed politics in the Soviet zone. Bizonia joined the American and British economies. Failed negotiations weakened four-power control. The Marshall Plan drew the Western zones into Western recovery. The London talks prepared a Western federal structure. Currency reform created separate monetary systems. The Berlin crisis destroyed what remained of practical four-power trust. Then German institutions on both sides turned separation into statehood. There was no single day when one person decided, Germany will now be 2 countries. The division was cumulative. Each decision made the next compromise harder. And there is one comparison that proves the outcome was not automatic: Austria. Austria was also divided into 4 occupation zones, and Vienna, like Berlin, was divided among the 4 powers. Yet Austria did not become East Austria and West Austria. In 1955, the occupying powers ended the occupation, and Austria adopted permanent neutrality. That comparison reveals the deeper answer. Occupation zones alone did not split Germany permanently. Germany divided because it became central to a much larger struggle over European security, economic recovery, political systems, and the balance of power. Its industrial capacity mattered. Its location mattered. The collapse of Allied trust mattered. And Berlin mattered perhaps most of all, because it gave both sides a place where compromise could look like retreat. By the end of 1949, the Federal Republic was developing as a parliamentary federal democracy increasingly connected to Western Europe. The German Democratic Republic was developing as a socialist state under SED rule inside the Soviet sphere. Neither arrangement had been announced in 1945. Neither side initially treated the division as a simple permanent settlement. But temporary institutions can harden when every crisis teaches both sides that cooperation is more dangerous than separation. Germany was not divided by one conference. It was not divided by one map. It was divided by a chain of choices that turned occupation into institutions, institutions into rival systems, and rival systems into states. And before those two states were fully established, the most dangerous test of that division had already begun. Inside the Soviet occupation zone sat a Western-controlled city of more than 2 million people. The Soviet Union had cut its surface access. The Western powers had answered with aircraft. If the airlift failed, West Berlin could fall. If the West tried to force its way through by land, the former Allies could end up shooting at each other. The next question was no longer why Germany had split. It was whether Berlin could survive the first major confrontation of the Cold War without starting another war.